Right. Good afternoon. I'm thrilled to introduce Vanessa Williamson, who's a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings. She's also a senior fellow at the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. She studies taxation and democracy in America. Her forthcoming book, The Price of Democracy, reveals the revolutionary power of taxation in American history. She's also the author of Read My Lips, Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes, and with Harvard professor Theda Skocpol, The Tea Party and the Remaking of Republican Conservatism. I could read on and on the numerous pieces that Vanessa has published in outlets like the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, Teen Vogue. She appears regularly on CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, C-SPAN, and so on. Please join me in welcoming Vanessa Williamson.
Hello, I'm so glad to be here. I want to talk to you today about taxation and democracy in America. And the way that I want to do that is to figure out how to move the slides. The space bar. Can you give me a hand? Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to talk to you today about changes at the IRS. And then I'm going to try and put those events in context. So what are we seeing right now? We're seeing massive cuts to the IRS workforce and to the protections for individualized tax data. And as the IRS's career staff are being eroded, we're beginning to see the politicization of tax enforcement. So what we're getting towards, I think, is kind of de facto tax policy making, but in the executive branch. But I want to put that in context because I want to talk about the last few months in the long history of contestation over taxation and democracy in America. So first, let me show you what's been going on at IRS. There has been a lot of news to follow, so I understand if you aren't totally up to date. All right, this is a chart that shows you the IRS workforce over time. There has been a 13% decline in IRS staffing just this year and all during tax season. That includes 5,000 people who took the fork in the road deferred resignation program and 7,000 probationary employees who were summarily fired. But the plan, represented by the dotted line, is to continue cutting the IRS by 20%, 40%, or even 50%. 50% is the dotted line. As you can see from the graph, this is an unprecedented move. The nadir of the IRS's effectiveness as an agency was probably in the 2010s, and you can see the decline on the chart in terms of staffing during that period, which was due to consistent underfunding over many years. It was reducing the workforce by about 2% a year, and we are on track to see a decline of at least 9 times that much this year. So that is a real problem for, taxpayers who would like the phone to be answered if they have a question, but the cuts have been heavily focused on compliance, and even more than that, they've been heavily focused on the portion of the IRS that enforces tax law for high earners. To give you just one example, there's a little piece of the IRS called the Global High Wealth Unit. These are the folks who look at both the individual and business taxes for the very, very richest people. The last time I saw data, they had lost 38% of their staff, and the audits that were underway were simply being left to expire. All right, so we're seeing these huge changes to the workforce. We're also seeing very fundamental undermining of longstanding data privacy protections at IRS. This would be worrying, of course, in any case, who would really want their tax data in the wrong hands, but it's particularly concerning given the misuse of data we're seeing at other agencies. I'm sure many of you are aware that thousands and perhaps millions of people have been moved to the death master file at Social Security despite being alive. And there was also an incident recently that a whistleblower has drawn attention to of data being extracted from the NLRB. So in that context, of course, the playing fast and loose with tax data is especially concerning, but it's also in the context of substantial errors that have been introduced to the IRS website soon after DOGE celebrated having made some changes. Those errors included both misinformation about how to file your taxes, which provoked genuine shock and horror among tax preparers this year, but also just typos. So errors at kind of every level that are, again, unprecedented. Probably the most significant change in IRS data security this year has been a memorandum of understanding between the IRS and the Department of Homeland Security and ICE. This is nominally for the exchange of information for non-tax criminal enforcement. Section 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code protects Americans and taxpayers' data by very strictly limiting the contexts in which tax data at IRS gets to go to other agencies. One of, and I should say, there are very, very strict protections here. So the penalties for disclosing or even inspecting tax data that you don't have a right to look at, there are criminal penalties that can result in things like 5 years in prison. So this is even for exposing the data of a single taxpayer. So there are very strong protections in place. One of the contexts in which agencies can get data from IRS are for the investigation and prosecution of non-tax criminal laws. So you can see that that's been highlighted here. But most immigration offenses, as I'm sure many of you know, are civil offenses, not criminal. And reports suggest that ICE is aiming to target 7 million people using this data access. That is far higher, as you won't be surprised to hear, than the number of immigrants currently facing final deportation orders. And of course, it's especially concerning given what we know about errors that have occurred in deportations so far this year, most obviously in the deportations to El Salvador. So I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of these moves. You're seeing the changes to data privacy and also the wholesale firing of probationary employees provoked multiple high-level resignations at IRS, which indicates, I think, both the seriousness of the challenges of the issues that have arisen at IRS this year, but also they mean that the implementation of the MOU that I just discussed will probably not receive appropriate levels of scrutiny. This shows you what's changed at IRS so far this year. Among the positions that have departed are the chief privacy officer, the chief in charge of data and analytics, the chief financial officer, the chief risk officer, and the chief information officer. So you've seen huge departures at the top of the portions of the IRS that protect data and handle systems, data systems. There have also been a number of departures, including the chief counsel, over concerns that the MOU violates Section 6103. And of course, we've seen, to the best of my knowledge, 5 IRS commissioners this year, but as I always say, I haven't checked my phone. We might be at 6. Okay, so, and then there are also you'll see that a number of posts are empty, and several positions appear to have been eliminated entirely. I should say that this is definitely a conservative estimate of the number of positions that have gone. So the chief for direct file is still on here, but direct file is reputedly being shut down, so that position will disappear as well, among others that I think are probably going to change in the coming weeks. So these are enormous changes. And I should say that IRS typically has, well, it has exactly 2 political appointees, the commissioner and the chief counsel, and they are appointed for 5-year terms. And that's because they are not supposed to turn over with the administration, right? This is part of the changes to IRS structures that were in part of the long response to the Nixon politicization, attempted politicization of IRS. So basically, the expectation would be that none of these positions would change with the administration. All right, so with the bulwark of civil servants departing, of course, as we already discussed earlier today, the agency is highly exposed to politicization, but it will also be massively less effective at tax enforcement. If the most extreme workforce cuts are implemented, the enforcement capacity will be next to nothing. And if we see tax morale decline, right, the willingness of Americans to pay taxes decline, that could have serious effects on tax receipts as well. And I want to stop here to share a fact that you may not know. So tax morale is the term for how willing people are to pay taxes. And you might think that in this country we complain a lot about taxes, which is true, but we also have exceptionally high tax morale by international standards. So we currently have a very, very strong norm of compliance in this country. And the question is, if we do enough damage to enforcement, or we do enough damage to people's confidence that their data is safe at IRS, will we switch? Will there be a tipping point to a norm of non-compliance? And if that happens, the effect on receipts will be in the hundreds of billions and potentially trillions of dollars. All right, so this might seem kind of strange. Why, as we are seeing substantial democratic erosion in this country, right, as we are seeing a lurch towards autocracy, why would you see a decline in tax enforcement? Is that in error? Is that a mistake on the part of autocrats, or is that just a unique case in the United States? And haven't you heard that taxation is tyranny? So why would these two things be moving together? The historical pattern is actually the reverse. It's very common, in fact, for tax capacity to decline when a democracy erodes, because it is representative legislatures and not tyrants who are good at raising revenue. And it is authoritarians who preside over tax systems that are at once hollow and politicized. If we look at the longer scope of American history, we can see that the people who have sought to undermine the capacity of the state to tax have always been America's anti-democratic forces, and always, not coincidentally, the forces of white supremacy. By the way, I'll say this is a picture, as many of you undoubtedly recognize, of the Boston Tea Party. And so surely an example of Americans' hatreds of taxes. You may not know that the Boston Tea Party was not in opposition to a tax increase. It was in fact in opposition to a corporate tax cut. So I share this fact just to suggest that perhaps the telling of American tax history that you heard in school may not have been correct. And if you want to hear the whole story of the Boston Tea Party, I'm more than happy to tell it in the question and answer section. Let's talk about Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is a Virginia patriot. You'll probably have heard his famous phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death." He opposed the ratification of the US Constitution, the Constitution that we live under today. And here's what he had to say at the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He imagined a picture so horrid, so wretched, so dreadful that he hated to dwell upon it. Congress, under this new Constitution, could pass a grievous and enormous tax that would compel owners to emancipate their slaves rather than pay the tax. It was too dangerous in Henry's mind, and in the mind of other slaveholders, to give the taxing power to the federal government, even one elected only by propertied white men, because taxation, in his mind, could lead to abolition. So the danger of democratic taxation from the very beginning has been its potential to threaten oligarchs. Henry was wrong, of course. The Constitution gave enormous protections to slavery, including multiple limits on the federal taxing power, and the limits on the taxing power are still with us today. If you've ever heard that a wealth tax would be unconstitutional, it is because of the clauses that slaveholders demanded to prevent abolition by taxation. So, as we all know, slavery ends only with the Civil War, and in the period after it, known as radical Reconstruction, America had a brief experiment with multiracial democracy in the American South. For a time, the federal government protected the right of Black men to vote. And in South Carolina, where a majority of the population was Black, a majority of the legislature was Black as well. Across the South, freedmen wanted two things. They wanted land so that they could work for themselves and not for their former enslavers. And they wanted schools for their kids and for themselves. But if freedom meant land and freedom meant schools, freedom meant taxes. And in the absence of federal land reform, it meant new property taxes in particular that would, the Reconstruction government hoped, encourage large landowners, the former slaveholders, to sell some of their property in small increments that freedmen could then buy. And they also needed the revenue, of course, from taxation because they wanted to build a public school system. In many states, this would have been the first public school system for both Black and white children because slaveholders hated taxes so much that there was no public schooling for white kids either. Now, we all know how Reconstruction ended with a campaign of white supremacist violence and terrorism that put former Confederates back in power. What you might not know is that anti-tax rhetoric was critical to the overthrow of Reconstruction. This is a former Confederate named Martin Witherspoon Gary. He was a Confederate general who famously refused to surrender at Appomattox. He rode away on his horse rather than surrender. Former Confederates like Gary organized themselves as taxpayers. He was a leader in the Taxpayer Convention of South Carolina, and they got a resoundingly positive reception in the North. Northern industrialists who'd gotten rich during the war were looking at their cities where spending was going up and where workers were demanding unions. And they were thinking, maybe universal suffrage is a mistake. It's actually true that during the Reconstruction period, suffrage was limited more strictly in the North than in the South. So they were worried as taxpayers, wealthy industrialists in the North, as taxpayers, they were beginning to doubt the value of universal suffrage. And so when they looked at people like Gary, they did not see an unreconstructed Confederate trying to fight the Civil War by new means. No, they saw a poor, beleaguered taxpayer. And when Gary literally planned and executed a campaign of murder to subvert the elections in South Carolina, bringing Reconstruction to an end, the North led him. The Reconstruction governments were replaced with what eventually consolidated as the Jim Crow regime. And that regime was markedly opposed to taxation. The Jim Crow governments cut taxes for the rich and for corporations. They shifted taxes onto the poor. They engaged in what were genuinely extraordinary levels of corruption and self-dealing, and they put in place supermajority requirements to raise taxes on property. Now, I grew up in California, so I grew up with one of these supermajority requirements myself, and I don't know how many people know that this was a policy innovation of the Jim Crow South, but it was. This is where we first see a explicit opposition to democratic rule on the question of taxation, specifically to prevent the taxation of property. What the Jim Crow governments were trying to achieve was to reinforce the voter suppression laws they were passing in the same period, so that even if somehow a biracial working class majority regained power in any of the southern states, they would still not be able to tax the rich. Now, why am I telling this story? Well, because to some extent we are reliving it. There was the first Reconstruction after the Civil War and the second Reconstruction in the 20th century civil rights movement. And we are living in, as we discussed earlier, the long backlash to that second Reconstruction. The welfare queen, famously the dog whistle of Ronald Reagan, was always balanced by the idea of the hardworking taxpayer, right? And this is a picture some of you will know of Howard Jarvis, who was helped pass that supermajority requirement in California that I mentioned earlier, that limitation on the powers of the majority to control the fiscal state. So we are reliving that to some substantial degree, I would say, particularly more recently. It is not a coincidence that the only major legislative achievement of the Trump administration was a tax cut, or any more than it is a coincidence that his supporters invaded the Capitol and flew Confederate flags. And now that he has returned to office and gutted the Internal Revenue Service, a process that, by undermining federal revenue, will reinforce the destruction of every other agency, from foreign aid to health and human services, I don't think we should be surprised that democratic erosion coincides with collapsing tax capacity, because I think our history would suggest that anti-tax politics is and always has been anti-democratic politics, because taxation is the price of democracy, and some people don't want to pay. Thank you.
Is this on? Yep, fantastic. Thank you so much, Vanessa. We have a question from a few of our students here, so we're going to start there. Jack S. asks, Trump has had issues in the past with the IRS. Do you think Trump is attacking the IRS out of self-interest, or is it more likely a general undermining in an effort to take more control?
I mean, I think Trump in some way personifies many of the concerns of his base, things like resentment, things like, attitudes about immigrants. I would never want to speculate into the internal workings of his mind. I'm trained as a political scientist, not as a psychologist or, I don't know, priest. I don't know what role you would expect someone to play. But what I will say is this. I think that the longstanding conservative attack on the IRS is part of a broader attack on the idea that government can work, and particularly that a government under democratic control, not democratic with a big D, democratic with a small d, or under popular control, that a government under popular control should be allowed to influence taxes. Because the thing that taxation does is assert the power of the polity, and in a democracy, the power of the people over the economic order, right? It takes private wealth and transfers it to the public. And it doesn't just do that, the way we do, for example, with a fee or a fine, or when someone has committed a crime. It says, no, even wealth that you earned, that you have a right to, that we think was done, even economic transactions that are legitimate, buying and selling, even those are subject to taxation, and therefore that some part of that private economic activity has a role to support public life. And I think that is anathema to the conservative ideology of the last 40 years, and as it has become increasingly extreme. So I don't think it's just about Donald Trump's personal taxes. I think it is deeply embedded in the contemporary Republican Party.
Great. Got another question from a student. Larry C. writes, I've previously worked in a former senator's constituency services office, and the modal call from constituents was them being upset that their taxes were taking too long to process. So if I dislike the IRS because they take my money, but also dislike the IRS because they are too slow at taking my money, what does effect messaging look like that highlights the importance of a well-staffed and well-funded IRS? What role are tariffs playing in the mind of Americans when it comes to taxes and the IRS?
All right, I'm going to take, there were two things there. There was a sudden swerve to tariffs, and I want to handle that one separately. So remind me if I don't get to it at first. I think it is going to be a very interesting tax season next year. Because if the cuts that have been put in place at IRS go through, it is going to affect taxpayer services. That is not a single anecdote. There is certainly data to back up that people feel very strongly about getting those refunds on time. For tons of people, that is the tax refund they receive is part of their economic planning. It covers things like winter utility bills. It covers buying new clothes for their kids. It's built into their economic planning. It is genuinely deeply problematic to hold up people's refunds. It's not just an annoyance in any way. And it's something people will notice in the same way that the changes at Social Security are an area where you might think that this, if government action can break through the incredible noise and the sort of loss of a media ecosystem that got facts to people, if there's a policy decision that can break through that, you would think that Social Security or tax season would be one that make that difference. I think, one of the things that the last few months are going to test is whether disabling large sections of government that do things that people actually like allows for a change in how people perceive government. Or even if it creates the incentive among some elected officials to speak on behalf of government and what government can do for people. I think that we've lived in a very long post-Reagan era where government is only ever discussed to insult it. And I think that in some ways contributed to the lack of support that our agencies saw this year. So I think it will be very interesting if, things like food safety and hurricane preparedness and other genuinely very boring administrative tasks that are both boring and important, if that breaks through to people. So I think next tax season is going to be very, very interesting. And I think, it would take a rhetorical shift on the part of elites to help people recognize that a well-funded government is the one that does a good job. Right? That not every government reform should be about adding new layers of oversight. Sometimes you actually just need to pay the guy who does the job, not the 12 people who watch him do the job, right? And in the same way, not every version of efficiency is cost cutting. And I think we've really lost those distinctions over time. So I think it will be very interesting if that kind of rhetoric can be rebuilt. And I think that the likelihood of delayed refunds next year is very high. So we will have an opportunity to see whether that message breaks through either directly through people waiting for checks that aren't coming, or indirectly through a changed political rhetoric. Can you?
So when we get to the tariffs, do you mind if I grab this? Okay, so there were two questions, remember. The second was about tariffs, but actually there's a fantastic question that also follows up on this one. We're going to come back to tariffs because we actually received a few more comments. But Mike W. asks, I just lost Mike W. One moment. There we go. Mike W. asks, if say 60 Minutes or maybe John Oliver were to come to you and say, what one story should we tell in depth to the public about what's happening at the IRS? What would it be? And what would you hope people would do with that information?
That is such a good question. I mean, I think, we've seen some genuinely excellent reporting about what's happening at IRS. And I think, following a through line that went from, by the way, the IRS employs people all across the country. It is widely misperceived that they are all somehow working in a building in Washington, D.C. They are not. They are all over the country, and they are taking calls, and they have offices that you can go to and get help with your taxes. But to follow maybe one office or even a couple of people who work at IRS about the jobs they do, and then trace what it means when they don't, right? What it means for regular people who have questions. I mean, one of the parts of the agency that have been absolutely gutted is the part that deals with small business. Small business owners have extremely complicated taxes, and now they are really not going to have anyone to call, right? So you could talk about that, the part on the service side. You could talk about what it means for enforcement, the audits that are being left to rot, and that's to someone's benefit. Someone is getting a big payday thanks to the American taxpayer, because the American taxpayer, right, the regular guys, his taxes were withheld this year, and this other guy is getting away with something. So I think a story like that connected, that humanized federal workforce, which I think we're seeing more of, and connected it to what it means for regular people and what it means for, really important things like growing inequality. That would be the story I would want to tell through the lens of a couple of individual workers.
Great. I'm going to go one more question before we turn back to tariffs here. So Jeff asks, excuse me, how does federalism affect issues of tax morale and compliance? If the IRS is not sufficiently staffed to police compliance, do we expect state tax regimes to take on an increased role in this respect? And do states send any data to the IRS about state taxpayers that could be used to at least identify individuals who do not properly report federal taxes?
Unfortunately, it mostly works the other way, that state tax administration relies on the federal. So for instance, many states rely on the federal earned income tax credit that sets their own tax credit. They rely on federal information gathering to support the state income tax. So I think mostly that it's a great question. What will that mean for state tax administration? I think it will mostly be a net negative, and there's very little capacity at the state level to replace what IRS does. It's simply, in the same way that no one raises money like the federal government. The IRS brought in $5 trillion this year. That's what it does. There's no one plays in that league. Literally no one. There's just philanthropy can't make up the difference when the federal government stops doing something. States can't make up the difference when the federal government stops doing something, at least on this issue. It's just, there's a reason that when George Washington became president, the first cabinet position was Treasury Secretary. It's because you need the incoming money to do anything else. It was also partly because Alexander Hamilton really wanted to be president and was, kind of a big deal. But it was also like there was a rational reason to do that first. It has a primacy in our fiscal state that just can't be replaced.
All right, I promised that we were coming back to tariffs. We have another question from a student, Theo L. asks, with tariffs on the horizon, what could be the future of the IRS and its impact on the average citizen, given that Trump mentioned wanting to have an external revenue system instead? So you kind of spoke to the amount of revenue raised. Put this in context about the debates over tariffs.
So I just wrote a historical book, so I'm going to tell you about tariffs more generally first, right? So the United States had an income tax in the Civil War and then allowed it to expire. And then tried to reinstitute it in 1894. This is one of the things William Jennings Bryan was really committed to, that this was a way to fight the oligarchy. Speaking of populism, so they tried to reinstitute income tax in 1894, and the Supreme Court overruled that in 1895 in the Pollock case, and they said that an income tax was unconstitutional. This was an enormous shock at the time because the 1894 income tax was very closely modeled on the one that had survived all the challenges in the Civil War era. So anyway, so we didn't get an income tax back until the passage of an income tax amendment. That was a state-by-state populist and progressive campaign to get the federal government the power to tax again. And I can go on about that at some length because it's an amazing story. But instead, I'm going to note that the federal government was funded with tariffs for most of our history. What we are doing today is not going to do that, man. That is not what's possible. We do not live in that world anymore, So there is no way in which never mind the particular tariff regime that is currently being imposed and unimposed every 12 hours, but we don't live in an economy like that anymore. You cannot fund a modern administrative state, a modern government with tariff revenue. It's just not available. So while one could redirect, the IRS to other forms of taxation, you could redirect the IRS to handle a value-added tax, for example, which is how every country in Europe uses as their sort of base tax to raise revenue for the federal government. Or the central government is very effective. You could certainly redirect the tax base that the IRS is responsible for, but you cannot redirect it to tariffs if you want to raise money on the order that we do for a modern government and a modern economy.
Great. Got another question here. I guess maybe it pulls on some of the populism or populist impulses, perhaps, themes of inequality. So I'm not sure who submitted this question, but they note, there have been many popular comparisons of our present era to the Gilded Age, with the prominence of money in politics and public elites like Elon Musk. Do you see the increase of the prominence of wealth disparity in America aligning with an increase in the appetite for redistribution like what followed the Gilded Age?
Now I get to tell you about the income tax. Hooray! Yes. There are many things that are similar about our contemporary era and the Gilded Age. That is certainly true. So when we were funding the government exclusively with tariffs, or nearly exclusively with tariffs, also with some excise taxes, people hated the tariff regime. They called it the mother of trusts, by which they meant that it was a system that allowed corporations to become monopolies, right? Because we're not just talking about an era where there were some people who were very rich. There were some companies that dominated entire industries, right? Standard Oil held more than 90% of the market. So it was a time not only of extreme wealth, it was a time of extreme consolidation of power in business, extreme monopolization, and modern analyses would suggest that the tariff regime redirected 8% of GDP from consumers, then primarily sort of farmers and regular people in the South and the West, to the industrial elite of the Northeast. So Americans hated this. There were all these sorts of exposés of the era, which are kind of a Piketty vibe if you look at them, about how the tax regime was worsening economic inequality, which was sort of on a level similar to ours today. And that is why it was possible to go state by state and pass an income tax amendment, that it was explicitly just about giving the federal government the power to tax incomes. And this passed overwhelmingly across the West. There was an article it was in Portland, Oregon. We're in Wisconsin, which is the very home of the modern income tax, as many of you probably know. But there was a story in the Oregon paper that they had passed the income tax amendment faster than they had chosen like a deputy flag bearer who stood by the door and opened it for the legislators coming in. That was how fast they had done it. In many places, it passed unanimously, right? So all across the West, the income tax was beloved. And in the South, which suffered from terribly poor state capacity and had by then, this is the early 20th century, by then basically entirely disenfranchised Black Americans and at the same time disenfranchised most of working class white Americans. Nonetheless, you see the income tax pass through those states as well. But what's really amazing is that it even manages to pass in New York State, where Rockefeller was sort of believed and largely did sort of own the legislature. But what happened was that they had voted down the income tax amendment like 3 or 4 times in New York, I can't remember. And then there was an election, and the Republicans at the time got routed because people were so angry that even it was a terrible economy at the time, even in a terrible economy, they were willing to protect these few people who were going to pay the income tax. At the time, it was intended to reach only the very richest people. And when the legislature reassembled, suddenly the income tax was back on the agenda and just swept through, passed far more states than it needed to become a part of the Constitution. So one of the interesting things I think about the moment we're in now with all this talk of tariffs is that 6 months ago I'd have said people didn't know what tariff was, and now, but I'm also confident that the faster they learn what tariffs are, the sooner they will dislike them, right? Because this is it's part of the American tradition, right? They recognize that this approach to revenue raising is profoundly regressive, and it's profoundly beneficial to a small handful of companies. And in the contemporary, as it was then, a small handful of companies that are very close with those in charge of the government.
All right, so I know we're running up on time, and I want to be mindful of that. And Raul has asked a question that I actually think it would be fun. Sorry for those that have already presented and are like, oh, done. Nope. I'm going to ask Vanessa first, but then I'd like to give everyone, including Barry, an opportunity to respond. So, and this is, I think, a good closing question maybe for us. Raul asks, in summary, can someone provide a reasonable guess as to the direction Trump is steering the United States?
What I like is that this was really easy and like a chill way to wrap up. Yeah, I mean, I think we're moving towards a personalist and authoritarian regime. I'm not saying that that's where we're going to get. I'm saying that's the direction that we are steering. We're seeing a decline. We're seeing executive aggrandizement that is increasing the power of the presidency while systematically trying to eliminate the nodes of power that threaten that consolidation of power. Right? We're seeing attacks on the judiciary. We're seeing a Congress that is unwilling to assert its authorities, and even as the executive increasingly attempts to take lawmaking power, and we're seeing attacks on civil society. Right, the final bastion of democracy is not the courts. It is certainly not the courts. It is civil society institutions like universities, like lawyers, like the media. And we've seen systematic attacks on those as well. So I think we're moving, in the direction of, Orban and other authoritarian regimes. And I don't think it's a done deal. I think there is, we have a very strong civic history in this country, but I think that is definitely the alternative to changing course.
Here's Barry, or Julia, Don, Will.
Which of our other speakers want to come add to what Vanessa has had to say? Dawn, you look like you're moving. Yeah, this is a light question for the end of the day. What
Thank you,
direction, please come join us. What direction is
Yeah,
Trump
we'll be
taking the
brief
United
since we're
States?
running up on time.
We each get 1 minute to tell
Yep,
us the future of
perfect.
American politics.
This is going to be very depressing also. So I think Vanessa mentioned Orban, and that has been in many ways a more useful comparison to 1930s Germany, which is often the historical example that's invoked. One of the differences is that Hungary is at best a third-rate power in the world. And so if Hungary becomes an authoritarian state, it's a bit of a problem for the EU because he can make things difficult for the European Union, but it doesn't have global implications. And as someone who was born outside the United States and moved here for grad school, so as an immigrant, and was always amazed by the ways in which American power had developed and was also taken for granted. I have a little bit of an immigrant's perspective still on this, which is to say, I think we're starting to see the decline of the American century, where the US will continue to be an important country because of its size and its scale, but the sort of post-1989 dominance of the globe is over, because we're ripping away forms of American soft power like USAID as China is stepping up. We are disinvesting in knowledge production and research as, again, China is stepping up. We are making our traditional allies hate us for no obvious reasons. We're swapping Canada for El Salvador as an ally. And so I think the long-term effects then are not just what happens to the US, but what happens to the global order when, for all of its shortcomings, the US has been a relatively stable and a relatively pro-democracy voice on the global stage. And when that voice becomes weaker or is less supportive of democratic ideals, what replaces it, I think, is going to be much worse.
Okay, I should just say, Amber's known me a long time and she should know better than to give me a second bite at the mic. So I think there's two things. I want to talk about kind of the political environment. I think one of the things that distinguishes Trump from some of the other actors we've seen on the global stage that have been associated with Democratic backsliding is that Trump isn't and never has been very popular. And when we look at the kind of political context, the through line here is we have an incredibly divided polity, an incredibly divided electorate. And so that means there's a lot of opposition to what Trump is doing, just as there was a lot of opposition to Obama and Biden. And I think that is, if you're concerned about what Trump is doing, I think that's an encouraging part of the story. And then the other part, I think, is a little bit less encouraging and more of a call to thinking about some kinds of action. And that is that while we're a very divided country and there's a lot of opposition to Trump, that our civil society is a little bit fragmented and less well organized and has been delegitimized. So to go back to Barry's comments at the beginning about political parties, we have spent decades delegitimizing political parties. We spent decades criticizing unions, decades criticizing all these sort of organized forms of action. And that's really where this diffuse resistance to Trump is, where it can become more powerful. And what we're seeing instead is that we have a very closely and deeply divided country, but one side is a lot more effective at consolidating power. It's kind of what I was trying to get at in my question to Will about institutions, whereas the sort of center left to left has been less effective in this sort of organization. So I think that's something for people who are concerned to really think about, is that is something that can change, but it requires people working together. So I'm trying to offer a little bit of a note of optimism here. I'll give it the mic now.
Yeah, actually, we're going to end on that note of optimism, right? Well, but first, can everyone join me in thanking Vanessa Williamson?